Our lecture title today, Psychological Research. Now that we've explored what psychology is and how it developed historically, we need to take an important step forward, understanding how psychologists actually study the mind and behavior. This brings us to Chapter 2, which focuses on psychological research. If Chapter 1 told us what psychology is, Chapter 2 tells us how psychology works. Section 2, Introduction. Imagine for a moment that you're watching the nightly news. The anchor says, a new study shows that drinking 2 cups of coffee a day makes people happier. The next day, another story says, coffee consumption is linked to anxiety and restlessness. Which one do you believe? This is where psychological research becomes critical. Without careful research methods, psychology could easily collapse into speculation, opinion, or sensational headlines. Psychology is a science, and science depends on systematic research, carefully designed investigations that seek reliable, testable answers. So in this chapter, we will ask, why is research so important to psychology? What approaches to research do psychologists use? How do they analyze findings and ensure ethical practices? Today, we'll focus on the first 2 questions, why research matters and what research methods psychologists rely on. Section 2.1, why is research important? Let's start with the big question. Why do we need research in psychology at all? The answer is simple, because common sense is not always reliable. Humans are prone to biases, assumptions, and errors in reasoning. What feels obvious to one person might be completely misleading. For example, many people believe that venting anger by letting off steam helps reduce aggression, yet research consistently shows the opposite. Venting can actually increase aggression rather than decrease it. Another example, we often believe we can accurately recall past events, but decades of research on memory demonstrate that our memories are not perfect records. They are reconstructed and subject to distortion. So, research is essential because it helps us move beyond intuition and establish evidence-based knowledge. The goals of scientific research in psychology, psychological research has several goals. Describe behavior. What is happening? Explain behavior. Why does it happen? Predict behavior. Under what conditions will it happen again? Control or change behavior. How can psychology be applied to improve people's lives? For example, describing might involve observing how children play. Explaining could explore why some children are more aggressive than others. Predicting might involve identifying which children are most likely to show aggression in the future. Controlling could involve developing interventions to reduce aggressive behavior. Without research, psychology would have no scientific foundation. It would be guesswork. With research, psychology becomes a rigorous science capable of improving human life. Section 2.2, Approaches to Research. Now that we see why research is so important, let's look at the main approaches psychologists use. Each method has strengths and weaknesses, and often psychologists combine them to get the clearest picture. Descriptive research methods. These methods involve observing and describing behavior without manipulating anything. They are useful for gathering detailed information, but they cannot establish cause and effect. Case studies. A case study is an in-depth investigation of a single individual or small group. Famous example, the case of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who survived an iron rod passing through his skull. His dramatic personality change gave early insight into how brain injury affects behavior. Case studies are valuable when studying rare conditions, but their findings cannot always be generalized to the wider population. Naturalistic observation. In this method, psychologists observe behavior in its natural setting, without interference. Example, Jane Goodall's work observing chimpanzees in the wild. The advantage is seeing genuine behavior in real-world contexts. The limitation is lack of control. Many variables cannot be managed. Surveys. Surveys involve asking large groups of people questions about their attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. They allow researchers to collect data from large samples quickly and cheaply. However, surveys rely on self-report, which can be biased. People may lie, exaggerate, or misunderstand questions. Correlational research. Sometimes psychologists look for relationships between variables. For example, the relationship between exercise and stress levels. A correlation tells us whether 2 variables are related and in what direction. Positive correlation, as one increases, so does the other. E.g., more hours studied, higher grades. Negative correlation, as one increases, the other decreases, e.g., more time watching TV, lower grades. Zero correlation, no relationship. But here's the key caution. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because 2 things are related doesn't mean one causes the other. For example, ice cream sales and drowning deaths are correlated, but the cause is a third variable, hot weather. Experimental research. The gold standard of psychology research is the controlled experiment. In an experiment, researchers manipulate one variable, the independent variable, to see its effect on another, the dependent variable, while controlling all other factors. For example, if we want to know whether sleep affects test performance, we could assign one group of students to sleep 8 hours and another group to sleep 4 hours, then compare their test results. Experiments allow researchers to make causal claims, to say with confidence that one factor influences another. However, experiments often take place in controlled settings, which may not perfectly reflect real-world conditions. Closing thoughts. So, in summary, research is the backbone of psychology. Without it, we would rely on intuition and assumption, which often mislead us. Through methods like case studies, naturalistic observation, surveys, correlational studies, and experiments, psychologists can systematically investigate human thought and behavior. Each method has strengths and weaknesses, but together they form a powerful toolkit for understanding people. Research allows psychology not just to describe human behavior, but to explain it, predict it, and ultimately apply that knowledge to improve lives. As we move forward, keep this in mind. Psychology is not just about what we know, it's about how we know it. The way we study people determines the quality of the knowledge we gain. Analyzing findings and ethics in research. We've now seen why research is so important in psychology and the different approaches researchers use: case studies, naturalistic observation, surveys, correlations, and experiments. But once a psychologist has collected the data, the next big question is, how do we make sense of it? And perhaps equally important, how do we ensure that research is conducted ethically, respecting the rights and dignity of the people and animals involved? That's where sections 2.3 and 2.4 come in, analyzing findings and ethics in research. Section 2.3, analyzing findings. Imagine you have just conducted a study. You've surveyed 200 college students about their sleep habits and their exam performance. You now have pages and pages of numbers. What do you do with all this information? How do you move from raw data to meaningful conclusions? But psychologists don't just want to describe their sample, they want to make inferences about the larger population. That's where inferential statistics come in. Inferential statistics help us determine whether our results are statistically significant, that is, unlikely to have occurred by chance. If students who slept more did better on exams, inferential statistics help us decide whether this difference is meaningful or whether it might simply be random noise in the data. This is where you may have heard terms like p-value and confidence interval. They indicate the degree of certainty researchers can have in their findings. Replication. Another critical part of analyzing findings is replication. A single study is never enough to establish truth. Other researchers must be able to repeat the study and find similar results. Replication ensures reliability and helps weed out false positives. In fact, psychology has faced a replication crisis in recent years, where many famous findings could not be consistently reproduced. This has reminded the field of the importance of transparency, careful design, and critical evaluation of results. Peer review. Before research is published, it undergoes peer review. Other experts in the field evaluate the methods, analysis, and conclusions. This system helps ensure quality and prevents flawed or biased work from entering the scientific record. So, analyzing findings is not just about crunching numbers. It's about interpreting those numbers carefully, testing their reliability, and making sure conclusions are valid. Section 2.4, Ethics in Research. Now, even if a study is methodologically perfect, there is another issue: ethics. Psychology involves people and sometimes animals as participants. Researchers have a responsibility to protect their subjects and treat them with respect. Let's look at some historical examples to see why ethics are so important. Unethical research in history. The Tuskegee syphilis study conducted in the U.S. between 1932 and 1972. Hundreds of African American men with syphilis were observed but deliberately not treated, even after penicillin became available. This horrific violation of ethics caused needless suffering and death. Milgram's obedience experiment, 1960s. Participants believed they were administering painful electric shocks to another person as part of a study on learning. In reality, no shocks were given, but the participants experienced extreme stress and guilt. While the findings about obedience were groundbreaking, the study raised serious questions about deception and harm. Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, 1971. College students were assigned roles as prisoners or guards in a simulated prison. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, with guards abusing prisoners. The study had to be terminated early due to psychological harm. These examples remind us that without ethical safeguards, research can cross dangerous lines. Ethical guidelines in modern psychology. Today, psychology has strict ethical standards enforced by organizations such as the American Psychological Association, APA. Key principles include informed consent. Participants must be told what the study involves, what risks are present, and that they can withdraw at any time. Protection from harm. Researchers must minimize the risk of physical or psychological harm. Confidentiality. Personal information must be kept private and secure. Deception. Sometimes deception is necessary, e.g. in social psychology studies. However, it must be justified, cause no lasting harm, and participants must be debriefed afterward, told the truth, and given the chance to ask questions. Animal research. When animals are used, researchers must follow strict welfare guidelines, ensuring humane treatment and using alternatives whenever possible. Institutional oversight. Before research can begin, it must be approved by an institutional review board, IRB, a committee that evaluates the ethical aspects of the study. The IRB ensures that participants' rights are protected and that the potential benefits of the research outweigh the risks. Closing thoughts. So, to conclude this chapter, research is what makes psychology a science. Analyzing findings allows us to move from data to meaningful conclusions, using statistical tools, replication, and peer review. Ethics ensure that in our pursuit of knowledge, we do not harm the very people we seek to understand and help. In short, research is not just about asking questions, it's about asking them responsibly and answering them honestly. The credibility of psychology as a discipline rests on these foundations. As you move forward in this course, I encourage you to think critically, not only about what psychologists discover, but also about how they discover it and whether their methods respect both the science and the dignity of those involved. This is where statistics come into play. In psychology, as in all sciences, statistics are the tools we use to analyze data and decide whether our findings are significant or just the result of chance. Descriptive statistics. The first step is usually descriptive statistics, which allow researchers to summarize the data. This includes measures such as mean, the average score, median, the middle score, mode, the most frequent score, standard deviation, a measure of how spread out the scores are. For example, if the average amount of sleep in your sample is 6.5 hours with a small standard deviation, most students got about the same amount of sleep, but if the standard deviation is large, sleep patterns varied widely. Graphs and charts also fall under descriptive statistics. They help researchers visualize trends and patterns in the data. Inferential statistics.